Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. All right. How's the food? All right. Okay, well, my name is Martinez-Davila. I want to first welcome all of you. This would not be possible with you here to enjoy the show as well. Uh-oh. How about that? Over to your chair. There we go. How's that? Yeah?
If you get it closer, it's the mic.
Okay. So yeah, no, welcome. My name is Martinez-Davila. I am president here of Nahalat, Shalom. Just want to welcome all of you. So first, thank yous, top first, always foremost, Esteban, right? I know you've probably seen them blurred somewhere fast, so please, there's an infinite number of thank yous that isn't even enough for what you do here. Also as well, Hector Contreras Lopez, Stephanie Sophie Sophia Cohen, Lee Smolovich, Lynn Gottlieb, Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, Bobby Coe, Diana Cohn, Adam Horowitz, Sandra Marroquin Evans, Christina Kaufman, Michelle Radden-Vogner, Linda Spies, Cecilia Chavez, Edie Buquerque, Maxine Paul, Benina Ballin, Emmett Mayan, Janelle Worthington, Veronica Medina, Josh Blair, Patricia Herschel, Glenn Wings, Kaya Niederman, Robin Berman, Alice Reardon, Eileen Dunn, I'm sure you've seen her somewhere as well here. Thank you so much, Eileen. LB, where's LB? And of course, some underwriters for this program. As you know, some of our funding was in danger, but we were thankful that we could recover a lot of it. But we do want to thank, because this project is supported in part by an award from the New Mexico Arts, a division of the Department of Cultural Affairs, and by the National Endowment for the Arts, and by the Stratton Pettit Foundation. Any other announcements? I can get you after the show, but without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Roger Martinez-Davila, your first panelist. Take it away.
Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you today. I'm horribly disappointed I am not there in Albuquerque. We had a family emergency with my mom, and like a good son, I needed to be there. So I appreciate your understanding. Um, Also, just want to acknowledge Herschel Wise for inviting me and encourage me to kind of present some new research on indigenous slavery and how we can think about that in the New Mexico context and also in the Jewish experience as well. So I'll present probably for about 50 minutes. I might try to cut it a little short. You'll notice I might move through some slides a little bit faster just to make sure that we save time for questions, because I definitely want to hear what you have to say. And um, I think I would probably more than anything just like to stop for a second and center and think about how important it is we are together today. That when we make time to be together as friends, as family, as a community, we are preserving our history and we're living it and we're creating new memories. And so I'm deeply grateful to the congregation for your hard work and your commitment to each other. It's only because that you choose to spend a Saturday or a Sunday or a Friday together that communities last. So I want to just extend that thank you to you. Thank you for making time. So today's lecture is called Negotiating Religion and Power, Sephardic Conversos, Indigenous Slavery, and Religious Identity in Colonial New Mexico. And the research I'm going to present today is from a variety of different sources, some of my own, but it is kind of a syncretic work in the essence of many different pieces to put together. So the first piece I'd like to think about is Negotiating Religion Power, a New Mexican story with global echoes. So today, I invite you to explore with me a story that begins in colonial New Mexico, but whose roots stretch deep into medieval Spain and whose branches extend into the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey, the Andes, the Caribbean, and beyond. This is a story about religion and power, how they intersected through the lives of people caught between worlds, conversos, or Jewish converts to Christianity and their descendants. Some of them were sincere Catholics. Others were forced to convert under pain of death. Still others lived as crypto-Jews, as we know from Stanley Horty's work, preserving fragments of their ancestral faith in secret. And by the 1600s, their descendants helped forge a new colonial order in the Americas. We're really going to get a sense of that today, I think. Their role, Sephardic descendants' role in shaping New Mexico and the world. And in New Mexico, that order that they created rested on the backs of the enslaved. Indigenous slavery, often connected with Genízaro servitude, was not peripheral. It was central. And we'll hear more today or tomorrow from Dr. La Madrid about the Genízaros. His scholarship is foundational to our understanding of colonial New Mexico. So I wanted to make sure to make that point. Also, indigenous slavery was about children captured in raids, women traded across households, and families forcibly baptized who became the labor force that kept colonial households and ranches and missions running. And many of those enslaved were recorded unknowingly in the margins of Catholic parish books, baptized, married, and buried by priests who themselves may have been descendants of Jews themselves. This is the kind of the paradox at the heart of this presentation. We're going to follow these threads of history through archival cases uncovered by the Native Bound and Unbound Project, which uses citizen science to transcribe hidden records of indigenous slavery. We'll also see how enslaved individuals lived, married, and sometimes resisted. Alongside of them, we'll trace the conversive families who helped build the society who wielded religious and legal authority while navigating their own complex identities. As you see, it's a tangle of things, and that's what is so remarkable, I think, about this history. And from there, we'll zoom out, actually, because sometimes it's hard to understand our own history, our own New Mexican history, without a broader perspective. And we'll think about the ethics of slavery and Jewish law as those were lived realities in the Ottoman diaspora when Jews relocated to Ottoman lands, and the economic expansion of the Sephardic people, especially in slaveholding in the Atlantic world. All of that converges back onto one place, New Mexico. So we're going to place that right into dialogue so we can appreciate this history. In this seemingly remote province, we find the entire drama of early modern history: forced migration, empire, race, religion, and survival played out in miniature. And we are left with the same question that haunts history everywhere. What do we do with stories of both trauma and complicity? Let's begin. So, recovering hidden histories, Conversos, Crypto Jews, and the Native Bound and Unbound Project. In this remote spaces of colonial New Mexico, religion and power intertwined in intimate and often invisible ways. And one of the most overlooked actors in the story are the Conversos, Jews who converted to Christianity. Their descendants would go on to populate the edges of the Spanish Empire. Some of these conversos became devout Catholics, embracing their new faith fully. Others converted merely to survive, retaining secret Jewish practices in private. Still others navigated a gray space, loyal to the church outwardly, yet quietly maintaining fragments of Jewish identity, memory, and ritual. These diverse converso identities are not speculative. Their names, the networks, and the professions appear in archival records, in wills and marriage certificates and land grants. Many became priests, soldiers, alcaldes, and slave owners. So it is through the Native Bound Unbound Project, which is directed by Dr. Esteban Rayal Galvez, that brings these histories to light. It's a groundbreaking citizen science initiative enlisting volunteers to transcribe and analyze colonial era documents. And its focus on indigenous slavery, particularly how Native peoples were baptized and married under conditions of forced servitude, is an important thing for us to think about. So I'll showcase some of their first research so far, just to show that it's always kind of a moving story. We're always learning new pieces. So parish records, how the church recorded slavery and converso life. So one of the most revealing insights from the Native Bound and Unbound Project is how Catholic parish registers became unintentional ledgers of slavery. These documents intended to sanctify Christian life, but also quietly chronicle colonial domination. In these baptismal marriage records, status and caste were routinely noted. Individuals identified as esclavos, slaves, libre, free, India, indigenous, mulatto, mixed race, mestiza, another mixed race. The church was not just a spiritual body, it was also an institution that enforced and normalized colonial racial hierarchies. Think about that for a second. The church is enforcing racial hierarchies. So it's all bound up together, that we see religion in new ways. Importantly, some of these records were created by clerics with known or suspected converso ancestries, descendants of Jews themselves. So, for example, priests with surnames like Altamirano de Castilla, who appear in both sacramental and inquisitional documents, were deeply embedded in colonial religious lives. And so when we read words like mulatto esclavo, who was married to an India, so a slave mulatto who was made to an indigenous woman, we're not just seeing a clerical record. We're witnessing how Jewish Christian descendants documented literally the subjugation of others, perhaps seeking to prove their loyalty to the crown and to the church. So, telling some forgotten lives, stories recovered by citizen scientists. Rather than speak in active terms, we're going to look at a couple of individual lives. And a lot of these documents are from 17th century sacramental entries, many of them from the parishes of Aguascalientes to the south, but they speak to the New Spanish frontier and to New Mexico. And in them, we will find lots of different cases of what is happening. We will encounter families that we're familiar with that are conversos, like the Carvajal family, and other ones that are suspected. And I would think what's really important to appreciate too is these stories aren't just data, right? They're acts of justice. They offer a voice to the silence. They let us ask, how did slavery become embedded in colonial society? So one of the first records we can look at, and this is actually from the transcription website, and it's called From the Page. And on the right-hand side, you can see transcriptions that have been done by everyday folks like yourselves, and then a document on the left where they're transcribing. So what's in these documents? So one is from 1676, and it speaks of an enslaved groom, a free indigenous bride, and a converso priest. So it's dated January 23rd, 1676, and it comes from the Villa Aguascalientes, and it documents the marriage of Antonio Lopez, labeled as a mulatto esclavo, an enslaved man of mixed African descent, to Maria Pascuala, simply described as an India or an indigenous woman who was likely free. Antonio was the legal property of Don Joseph de Parga, and that fact is noted plainly in the church register. This entry is remarkable illustration of how Catholic rituals administered by converso clergy normalized and recorded slavery as a part of a sacred or sacramental life. Their marriage was performed without ecclesiastical rites at first, we know. Only 5 years later, in 1689, were the couple fully, as the document says, veiled in a second and formal church ceremony. This delay may reflect the church's lower prioritization of marriages involving enslaved or mixed status couples. So we're seeing how race is even playing out here. What makes this case even more intriguing is the cast of witnesses and clerics, such as Don Baltasar Fernando de Castilla, or Don Manuel Altamirano de Castilla, and Don Sebastián de Castilla. These surnames, especially de Castilla, frequently appear in converso genealogies. This isn't proof positive, but it's suggestive, and it's quite possible that Baltasar, the officiating priest, was himself of Jewish ancestry and now serving, interestingly enough, as the agent of Christian authority. So we have a marriage between an enslaved African descended man and a free indigenous woman, sanctified by a Catholic priest. So these documents start to show us what's really happening on the ground in the colonial period and these entanglements of hierarchy and status. And another document from 1690, we can read of a free mulatto. The second case is dated from January 31st of 1690, again from Aguascalientes, and it involves Gregorio Perez, un mulatto libre. So he's a free man of African descent, but possibly some indigenous ancestry as well. What stands out here is the detail about his parentage. Gregorio is the legitimate son of an enslaved mulatto father and a free indigenous woman who had taken the name Luisa de Alva. And according to Spanish colonial law, specifically the principle of partus securum veterum, a child's legal status followed that of the mother. Because Luisa was free, Gregorio was born free, despite his father's enslavement. This shows how gender and race kind of converge in this assignment of freedom and bondage. It's a really complicated world that the rules are set and we have to abide by them. We know that Gregorio marries Maria de las Nieves, described as a mestiza widow of an Indian man. She likely occupied an intermediate caste position in general society. We know that the ceremony was witnessed by a Diego González de Serna, another by the last name of Esparza and Herrera, all bearing surnames in likelihood of higher social station. And this participation, especially of the witnesses, confirmed a certain kind of legitimacy upon the union, illustrating the social boundaries being actively managed within the Catholic ritual. It shows us that free people of color, as well as the enslaved, were intimately connected with with the lower nobility and everyday Spaniards and mestizos. This is how society functioned. And one last case that I would like to show is from 1692, and it actually deals with a transatlantic bondage story. This one comes from September 8th and further deepens our understanding of the transatlantic dimensions of slavery and the later caste system of colonial New Spain. The groom Juan Francisco is recorded as a mulatto esclavo, an enslaved man of African mixed descent, born not in the Americas, but actually in Puerto de Santa Maria in Spain. His presence in the city where he lived in Mexico, where he had lived for 13 years under the ownership of Captain Miguel Martin Barragan, shows how slavery moved with imperial expansion from Iberian ports to colonial frontier. And his bride, Maria de la Candelaria, is labeled a coyota, a caste term typically used to describe someone of mixed indigenous and mestizo heritage. Maria's life trajectory from her birth in San Luis Potosí to her upbringing in northern Mexico, a place with strong indigenous ties, suggests that she was displaced and that she was placed into domestic service or put for sale. She had no surviving parents at the time of her marriage, which further implies just how vulnerable a woman could be in this time period. The marriage record also contains unusually rich detail. It hints that Mary or Maria may have sought her freedom later in time. A notation refers to her being removed from an abusive situation at one time, raising the possibility that women had maybe had more agency, more control of their lives, even within the lives of bondage. So these are some of the cases that we're already starting to see that are coming out of the work of everyday people like all of us to kind of figure out what is the role of actually of conversos, Jewish descendants in New Mexico in slavery. Yeah, so some of the patterns that I'd like to figure out that we can see that are coming from this is first, they kind of show interethnic and mixed status marriages were quite common, especially among Afro-descended men and indigenous or mestiza women. This reflects the demographic realities of a frontier society where African, indigenous, and European populations intermingled through coercion, proximity, and sometimes by choice. And they kind of challenged some of the rigid norms of other places. But as we know, New Mexico was the end of the earth. And so this required more intermixing. Second, what we know is slavery is not hidden in these records, it's declared. Terms like mulatto esclavo or India libre or coyota appear alongside of names and parentage. Even the names of owners are frequently included. These were not euphemistic mentions. Enslavement was publicly visible, embedded in the Catholic rites like baptism and marriage. In effect, the church became a registrar of slavery, codifying status in its most sacred of institutions. Now, among those colonial parish archives, then there is traces of the conversos and crypto Jews, those who are still practicing. As we start to examine the finer details of the marriage and burial records, certain names that emerge that point to overlooked presence, the conversos and crypto Jews. So take, for instance, in one of the records from Antonio Lopez, who is an enslaved African man, we see a reference to the Altamirano de Castilla family. They were intermarried with a very well-known Carvajal family of northern Mexico, as well as the Vargas Carvajal family that helps to resettle and reconquer New Mexico. So we know that these individuals in the records, sometimes even if we can't trace them as the actual individual slave owners that are of Jewish heritage, they're involved in the process. They're complicit in the process. They have a role to play. Another one that we encounter is Don Bartolome Soto del Carvajal. He's a recurring clerical figure in these records, appearing in multiple ceremonies from the 1660s and 1670s. Again, another family that we know of converso origins that is deeply involved in these processes. And there are other ones that kind of stand out too. There's an individual by the name of Miguel Martín Barragan, who was an enslaver of Juan Francisco in 1692. His family appears in 1572 back in Spain, about 100 years before. The family was actually brought in front of the Inquisition in Cordova, Spain, and investigated for their blasphemy and their heretical beliefs. So, what we can see is it's quite interesting that there simultaneously, maybe these are individuals that are persecuted in their own way, but they're persecutors as well. I think it really helps to complicate our perspective of the past that there are no easy answers here. Now, if we think about New Mexico's conversional lineages and agents of empire, we would be remiss not to mention the work of Dr. Stanley Horty, a good friend and a colleague to us there in Albuquerque. What we can remind ourselves about is that, conversos were critical in the conquest and the settlement and the development of colonial life in New Mexico. Whether this is the Romero family, the Robledo family, the Carvajal and Gonzalez family, Baca, Ortiz, and Chavez families, all of them were intermarried at many times and exhibited kind of what we might expect from maybe converso families, endogamous patterns of intermarriage. So these marriages amongst women's families. So very important to, I think, recognize. And that they held real power. We only have to think of Diego de Vargas, the Spanish officer who led the reconquest in New Mexico after the Pueblo Revolt, as a key part of this process. So these are individuals of great standing and influence, and they sit at the top of this colonial administration. And I think now it starts to bring up really hard questions about to what extent do these conversers really understand who they were and maybe even paid attention to their heritage, paid attention or understood what had been taught before to their families as Jewish members of society. So we know that conversos were slaveholders and that they were involved across the whole frontier. And I'm going to skip this slide because I want to be cognizant of time, because I want to talk a little bit about the Torah and its teachings about slavery and its different model. So, to understand how deeply converso practices diverge from Jewish tradition, we must revisit the Torah's approach to slavery. The Hebrew Bible does not abolish slavery, but it has its limits. It regulates it and frames it within a strong ethical imperative rooted in memory. Also, I would like to note very quickly, I am not a scholar of the Torah. I'm not a rabbi. I'm just a historian of the Sephardim, and thus I'd ask you to consider my points here to be general overall. Moreover, we're really fortunate to have Rabbi Lynn with us at the festival, and I defer to her. I absolutely defer to her wisdom and her expertise. I hope that she'll add to this and enhance my limited presentation here on Jewish perspectives of slavery. And moreover, I hope that she will note and address, most importantly, any errors I make. So thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate you. So first, Hebrew slavery was not meant to be perpetual. Actually, in Exodus 21:2, it states, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he's to serve for 6 years, but in the seventh he shall go free. The Jubilee year, described in Leviticus 25, called for the release of debts and captives every 50 years. Slavery was seen as temporary, not necessarily generational, and definitely not hereditary. Second, the Torah insists on humane treatment. Exodus again speaks to the mandate that if a master injures a servant, causing the loss of an eye or a tooth, the servant must be freed. Even an act of cruelty carries a cost. Masters were reminded that their power is not absolute. Third, slaves in Israelite households were included in spiritual life. They rested on the Sabbath. Male slaves could be circumcised. They ate the Passover meal. In short, they were seen as members of the covenantal community, not as permanently outside of it. And so what is underlying this kind of perspective from a Jewish perspective is this power refrain. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. This command appears repeatedly through Exodus and Deuteronomy. It tells the Israelites, you know what it is like to be subjugated, to be powerless. That memory must shape you and how you treat others. Another place that we can think about is the Torah's framework and Jewish rabbinic tradition, which further refine the moral limits of slavery. The Talmud teaches a provocative saying, he who acquires a slave acquires a master. This was not irony, it was law. The statement conveyed that a master bore full responsibility for a slave's welfare, their food, their shelter, even the quality of the bedding had to match the master's own. Jewish law treated slaves as liminal persons, yes, not fully Jewish, but no longer pagans. And male non-Jewish slaves were to be circumcised at times, and both men and women were expected to observe core commandments. Additionally, there was manumission. There was a possibility that slaves could become free by becoming and accepting Judaism as their faith. And there's an expectation that Jews and the Jewish community should make that available to their slaves. It wasn't always the case, but it's really a different, I think, distinction that we can see in terms of how slavery is approached in the ancient world and even later. Even jurists like Maimonides, who we know a great about, further elaborated on this. In his Mishnah Torah, he outlines detailed protections for slaves, condemns excessive labor, cruelty, and humiliation. He insists that masters follow the ways of the wise and act with mercy, not just within the boundaries of the law, but according to its spirit. So I think this is important to remember, is that as we start to consider the colonial context in New Mexico, but even maybe in other places, there's a real departure. And whether this is a conscious departure or an unconscious one, it's real. And so it's very difficult then to kind of, I think, fully appreciate what slavery meant in New Mexico, that this other dominant ideology of the Spanish Catholics really was overwhelming. So we can see that there's a very, significant difference between New Mexico and Jewish law, that we see that slavery was highly regulated in traditional Judaism. It was time limited, it was spiritually inclusive, and oriented towards the idea that you could eventually be freed. In colonial New Mexico, none of these conditions held. And in this way, we can hold our ancestors responsible for that. Here, slavery in New Mexico was lifelong hereditary. There was no 7-year release. Now, if you want to think about it in the broader context, which I think is always important, is, well, we know what's happening in New Mexico. We know what happened in ancient times, in the time of the Torah. Well, what about in between? There's a lot of history there. So what were Jews doing on the eve of the expulsion from Spain and from Portugal in 1492 and 1497? If we turn back to those twilight years of Jewish life, it's a period often remembered for Jewish persecution, the Inquisition investigating converts to Christianity, and this forced migration. Absolutely, and rightly so. But the narrative of suffering must be set alongside of a more complex truth. Some Jews were also participants in the institution of slavery in medieval Spain. One of the striking examples that I present here is from 1490. It's just 2 years before the expulsion in the city of Malaga. And a Jewish man by the name of Yuda Abenda filed a formal complaint before the crown. So what was his grievance? That a Muslim man, Muhammad Mahin, had unlawfully taken a slave that they had co-owned. That's right. A Jew and a Muslim jointly own a human being in late medieval Castile. That was the case. When Mahin attempted to abscond with the slave, Judah sought the royal intervention, and the outcome was that the monarchy was on the side of the Jewish individual here. His ownership of the slave was not only legal, it was protected by the state. And this reveals a couple of really important points, I think. First, Jews were not outsiders to Castilian economic life, rather, they were central to it. And in this sense, too, they owned slaves. Second, slavery in medieval Iberia was not yet fully racialized. So you could have been African, Muslim, Tartar, or even Christian. What mattered most was not your skin color, but really more of an issue of how you were acquired. And usually this was in the course of a war where you were taken ransom, you were taken as a debt, or maybe there was a religious difference. So it really wasn't this dynamic that we see in the Americas of the castas of racialized power. Another case that we can take a look at from 1491, it relates to a Jew, a Christian, and an enslaved boy. Other than that sounding like the worst joke you've ever, start to a joke you've ever encountered, it is an important case. Just 1 year before the monarchs expelled Jews from Spain, this startling case comes from the city of Cordoba, and it involves three people: a Jewish tax official, a Christian subject, and an enslaved boy. The Jewish figure in question was Yusei, or Joseph, likely a tax farmer or a crown-appointed tax collector. His counterpart was a Christian named Alfonso de Castro, and their dispute centered on an unpaid tax or fine. In response to Alfonso's refusal to pay, Yusei seized an enslaved child as collateral. That's right, a Jew confiscated a Christian slave. So again, it's very complicated in terms of who has power here, who doesn't have power. It really complicates our narrative. Alfonso clearly protested, not against the seizure, but against the idea that a Jew could exercise power over him. He complained in the record because he says, because I am a Christian, I feel it is improper that the king is doing this to me, that a Jew can confiscate my property. But we understand from Castilian law that no, that Yusuf was able to collect this property. And ultimately, we see this kind of tension also that is inside of Christian society on the eve of expulsion, this type of economic jealousy that can occur, this way of thinking maybe we can eliminate and get rid of Jewish influence in Iberia by just getting rid of them all so that we don't have to compete with them anymore. This is the kind of complicated stir of the world that we're living in. I'd also think about other places because when we think about New Mexico, what other places are happening? We also see Sephardic Jews who have slaves in actually the Ottoman world in present day Turkey. So as we remember, many Sephardic Jews, they chose first to go to Lisbon in Portugal. Many came into the Americas as hidden descendants because they were prohibited by the crown from immigrating to the Americas. Many went to the Low Countries, to Holland, Netherlands. And then a large portion moved into the Mediterranean, into that Islamic Sea, and found refuge in the Ottoman Empire underneath Sultan Bayez II, who recognized their commercial and administrative skills. And here they entered a very different society, a Muslim imperial structure with its own rules about slavery, conversion, and religious relationships. Slavery was equally legal in the Ottoman world, and Jewish ownership of slaves, especially domestic ones, was not unusual. But this presented what was really interesting outside of the Catholic context, out of the Christian context. It presented a non-Jewish slave. It presented this idea that a non-Jewish slave could undergo partial conversion to Judaism inside of a Jewish household inside of an Islamic nation. It's a very kind of strange environment, right? So whose rules are we following? We're trying to follow the imperial rules of the Ottomans, but we have our own religious law that we want to follow. And then it's just the broader world of the early modern period. So what we do know, though, which is really, I think, important, is Jews are always subjugated. They're never in a majority. So by Ottoman law, that strictly prohibited Jews from proselytizing Muslims or Christians. So to convert a Christian war captive, as you know, could happen, could actually risk severe punishment for a Jewish individual. And so this becomes just a very, very difficult situation. So much so that basic rabbinic rabbis and the community leaders basically focus on, we want to first be sure that we do not require any illegal conversions, and then we don't also want to violate any Jewish law. So trying to balance between Ottoman law and Jewish belief systems. It's very pragmatic in that respect. If we turn finally back, coming back to the Americas and thinking about New Mexico again, we can also think about the Caribbean. And so, what is that story? Well, there we absolutely know as Sephardic Jews were fleeing from Spain and Portugal, as they moved into the Caribbean, they settled in the Dutch and British Atlantic colonies where they could actually practice freely, worship freely, as well as trade freely in places like Suriname, Curaçao, Jamaica, and Barbados. They created some of the earliest stable Jewish communities in the Americas, and these communities were highly observant, organized, and deeply commercial. They were not like what we would see in the Spanish Americas. These were not marginalized groups. Rather, this Sephardim held land, ran transatlantic trade networks, and even obtained communal autonomy under tolerant colonial regimes. So this is quite interesting because we see that actually now these Sephardic Jews are actually in the lead now. They're in control. But we know that they were deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade of Africans. And so this is a really stark contradiction. Um, a people whose foundational rituals celebrate liberation, the Passover, the Exodus from Egypt, now participated in a brutal system of bondage. In Suriname, Jewish settlers owned dozens, sometimes hundreds of slaves. Some rabbis owned slaves. Some synagogue elders financed sugar mills worked by enslaved hands. In Curaçao, Jews dominated the slave trade as brokers and financiers. So why did they do it, right? Well, in part, this is about survival. In the colonial Atlantic world, economic security meant owning land and labor. And this complicates our understanding of what it meant to be Jewish and victimhood. To what extent are Jews involved in oppression, but also oppressed themselves? Again, there are just never any easy answers to this. And that's why I think we embrace all the stories so we can better understand what it means. We know that they justified slavery through historical texts, through Torah, through different response elements of that. And then basically the principle was if our ancestors practiced it, so can we. Now, an important thing to remember was in Judaism, this was not chattel slavery, where it was inherited from generation to generation. And there were options to move out of a slavery if you're under the control of a good Jewish individual. And so I think those are important things to recognize. The last piece that I'm going to kind of wrap up with, and we started a little bit late, so I'm going to just go just a little longer, but I'm going to save 15 minutes for us, is to talk about the Carvajal and Santa Maria clan in the New World. So we find them in Mexico City. We find them in New Mexico. We also find them in Peru. They actually traveled with their cousin Hernan Pizarro to conquer the Incas. And they were essential in the viceroyalty of Peru and the region now known as Bolivia or Charcas. The image I'm showing you here is actually of Potosí and present-day Potosí and present-day Bolivia, and it is literally a silver and tin mountain that was discovered by the Spanish. And during the late 1500s, early 1600s, most global silver came from this mountain. This is the source of all of Spain's wealth. And who was responsible for managing this piece? Well, it actually included Carvajales, who had been rabbinic families. The Levy family, originally from Burgos, Spain, who then had synagogues in Toledo, but also had relationships all across Iberia. Many of those families converted from the Levy to the Santa Maria family and intermarried with the Carvajals. Well, as they come into the New World, they're no longer rabbis, but they're actually bishops. And actually, they held judgeships in Charcas and Bolivia, and they were responsible for influencing imperial policy at the highest levels. So, in this way, we understand that these families were very, very instrumental in brutal conditions in terms of like utilizing at first indigenous slaves, but then recognizing because the population decline was so significant in South America because of disease and overwork, they justified we need to actually start importing African slaves to get the work done. And simultaneously, we can appreciate too was is that this colonial administration was more than just even about the exploitation of peoples, whether indigenous or those from Africa. It was that exploitation of the environment in a time period today when we think about our globe and our earth to being protected. We actually have cases from Charcas where we know in order to purify silver and other precious metals, they were using mercury to do this. And this mercury contaminated and poisoned rivers in the area and caused horrible economic and health damage to the local community. So, in many ways, I think what you're kind of left with, and I speak about this really, I would say, uh, honestly, because this is my family. This is my family that did this, that I know that I'm related to. And it's really hard to understand if they came from this persecuted background, how could they do these things to other peoples? How is this possible? And part of this is ultimately about, how much they had become Catholics, how much they had turned their away from Judaism, that they had a kind of a sense of a divine mandate that now that we are Christians, we may have been of Jewish stock, but we believe in this Catholic doctrine. We believe in a theology of domination. And so this is how you have this environment of Iberian colonization. And here we have Cardinal Bernardino de Carvajal, who was a member of the wider network. And in 1492, this gentleman is just three generations away from his rabbinic grandfather, but he's a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church. But he was also shockingly responsible for securing the titles for Ferdinand and Isabel that made them the Catholic monarchs. So, super Catholic. He also was pivotal in securing the papal bulls that granted the Americas to Spain and basically uh, acknowledged and accelerated the conquest and the destruction of the Indies. So, it's a really difficult kind of time period to think about. Ultimately, I think what we can think about, and I'm just wrapping up now, is that this tradition is we're somewhere in between tradition and transgression, this converso slaveholder's legacy. That in colonial New Mexico or in colonial Charcas, um, there's this accomplishment of Sephardic Jews and descendants actually being more secure, of being able to move forward into their future, but the contradiction of what they do in that process, what they do to others to ensure their own survival. And I would like just to conclude with just this notion of how does this fit into the context of New Mexico and indigenous slavery and the global Sephardic heritage. I would say if we finally return to New Mexico, to this rugged frontier where the story began, here at the edges of the empire, we've explored how slavery operated not only as a labor element, but as a tool of conversion, of control and community formation. The records that we see from from native bound and unbound show us how indigenous people were enslaved, then baptized into new religions and married under the shadow of Spanish authority, often at the hands of conversos who themselves had gone through similar circumstances. But this is not just, a Spanish story. It's the converso story of priests, of ranchers, of magistrates that carry the marks of ancestry. They were descended from people forced to abandon Judaism and flee the Inquisition. But in this historical tragic twist, some of them rose to prominence not in resistance to the empire, but within it to enforce the empire. And that's why I think New Mexico is so fascinating, which is it's that mix of like, how do we understand that complicated mix of religion, power, race, and identity? It's an open question. Thank you.
Martinez-Davila. Do we have time for maybe like 10-minute Q&A? Does that work?
That's good.
Yeah, okay. So here's the camera. It has a mic, so speak into this so we can hear your question, and then just come up close if you have a question, or we can relate for
Roger.
Roger. Yeah,
Not just Roger.
or just Roger. Thank you.
You come up there.
Right, let's see if we can hear it. Right?
Test.
Can you hear him, Roger?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Tony Jeffries. I cannot hear all of this without feeling
A little
myself
closer.
pulled in every possible direction. I am a descendant of a family that came here in 1595. And there's no question that they were Conversos because in order to come here, they had to sign affidavits that they weren't Jewish. So we know perfectly well they were Jewish. And they came here to the Rio Grande Valley. So, and at that time, of course, you couldn't necessarily bring a lot of women to an area that was so difficult. And so, undoubtedly, my family married with the Indigenous. My question that that has troubled me always is it a given that my family had to have been involved in slavery ownership? Is there just no question about it?
You know, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your personal story with us. I think this is what community is about, right? Understanding who's in the room and our own stories, whether those are Ashkenazi stories or Sephardic stories or other stories. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to speak from experience, which is I would think it's probably if your family was of a higher status, landowners, it's highly likely that your family was involved in the slave trade. In my house in Colorado Springs, my family came to San Antonio as La Carvajalas, Texas, in 1713 as soldiers to found the Alamo, as you know it. They were conversos. In our own stack of family documents we still hold today, I have one from the 1830s. It's a bill of sale for a number of things that were purchased at a store. And at the bottom of the document is for the purchase of a slave woman named Luciana. And, it's one of these documents that is simultaneously really difficult to know that is in our family, but really important to know it exists, that it really captures the irony and the difficultness of our identity. The other piece I would add too, though, which is I think interesting too, is because we now have genetic genealogy to look at our past too. Um, there are really interesting stories in those. So even though my genome shows like a Sephardic Jewish heritage, it also shows sub-Saharan African heritage. Portuguese heritage, Spanish heritage, North African heritage, South American heritage, and as well, about 30% of me is indigenous. So I think it also brings another question up, which is I've always wondered at a certain level, because it's only a couple of generations away, was I potentially related to her? Is she one of my relatives? And was she brought into the family? I think that's a rosy way of thinking about it. I hope. But if nothing else, I do know that our families were deeply involved in slavery. And I think we have to be cognizant of not being too presentist. Historians use this language of presentism, which is really important, I think, for all of us to remember. We live after the European Enlightenment. We live after the creation of the United States and this belief, Montague's belief, that all humans are created equally. This was not a belief that existed before the 1700s. And so, for us, in many ways, to make a judgment about the past, about slavery, is kind of in some ways inappropriate. It doesn't mean that for our sensibilities today, we know that this is wrong. But at that time period, literally humankind had not come across those ideas yet. So that's a complication.
Thank you, I think.
Hi, Robert. Esteban Reyes. Beyond Esteban, not Esteban Reyes. I was curious, I know that in my family there is clearly like crypto-Jewish heritage. I also know that there's some really very, for me anyway, unsettling historic moments that my family or family members didn't do things that I think were really particularly wonderful. I'm wondering, is there some sort of a graph or a timeline that shows like when Jews first got into Spain and like how slavery began to be a part of the Iberian Peninsula and kind of how Jews adopted and basically became slave owners?
Wow, just like what a great question. This is what's so remarkable about our shared heritage, right? When we talk about Jewish heritage, we have to talk across thousands of years. It's not like the United States where we say, oh, we're coming up on our 250th anniversary next year. So, a real quick way of like exploring the idea is to say Iberia was first like really encountered from the Mediterranean peoples through the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians. So the Phoenicians were from Lebanon, and they created like trading empires all across the Mediterranean. So roughly, probably as early as maybe 1800 before the Common Era. So 18 years before the time of the modern calendar, we know Jewish communities were already inside of Spain. So it is a deep, deep history there. And this is why the Sephardim really kind of perceive of themselves as a really distinctive community. The other turning point where we really see Jewish life really uh, flourishing and becoming really substantial is out of one of the most horrible events in Jewish history, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. And that's when, all Jews were cast from Judea and said, you must leave by the Romans. And that brought the next large group of immigrants to Iberia, which now, as we think from that period on, from 70 all the way to 1492, we're going to have basically 1500 years of uninterrupted Jewish heritage, culture, society. And what I think to answer your question, what we see is because Jews were so involved as this kind of classic intermediary between Christian populations and Muslim populations, and we'll remember in Spain from 711 to 1492, there were Islamic and Christian kingdoms in Spain. So Jews were the perfect community that could live in between both parties. They could commute between worlds, both religiously and in a way that they could understand other religious groups, but also linguistically. They spoke Hebrew, they spoke Arabic, and they probably spoke the local dialect of Castilian where they were. Because they're so involved in this society, they're going to be involved with slavery. They're going to be involved with tax farming, which is why you often get this horrible situation where, no one wants to collect taxes for the king, so the king makes Jewish people collect it. That's why you have some of these problems, is because let's give this really uncomfortable job to someone else. So in this respect, I would say that is the kind of like, I think the connectivity of this history of the Sephardim in Spain and Jewish history, but also just their role in society as intermediaries, which means there's no way you can't participate. You're involved in all aspects of it. Oh, I can't hear y'all, by the way. Ah,
Sorry
you're
about
back.
that.
Great.
One more question, is that fine, Roger?
Yes, sir.
All right, cool.
Hello there, I'm Efraim. My question is, when did Holland establish the Sephardic community there from Spain? When did the Spanish Jews leave for Holland? And anyway, that's my question.
I think I got the question. You're asking about when did the Spanish Jews kind of leave from Holland and the Netherlands? Is that what the question was?
When did they leave Spain for Holland?
Right. Okay. So excellent question. So I think we have to think about this as not just one moment of like a diaspora, but of continuous flow. So I'm going to do something really weird, which is I'm going to take you back further in time to explain the time you're asking about, which is the late 1400s. So we know Jews were not first expelled from Spain. It first happened in the 1200s in England. They kicked them all out. And then the French followed about 100 years later and they kicked them all out. And so we started to actually have Sephardic communities really actually welcoming immigrants from other parts of Europe into Spain to incorporate them into this safe place of Iberia, ironic as it is. Um, as we can imagine, as we get closer to 1492, there's a lot of stress on the Jewish community in Spain. Most notably, in the 1390s, there were massive anti-Jewish pogroms, and this is a word that we derive from Eastern Europe, pogroms like
Yes.
loud, thunderous storms, where Jews were targeted for conversion, for murder, and for expulsion. That created a moment from 1390 to 1492 of an intensive movement of populations. Having worked with Sephardic families and Converso families pursuing Spanish and Portuguese citizenship, I often encounter documents showing families leaving from Barcelona, from Sevilla, from Cordova, moving into the Ottoman Empire, to Egypt, to Alexandria, to Italy in the early 1400s. And it only accelerates as we get closer to 1490. Now, to answer your specific question about Holland and the Netherlands, really, when the Habsburg Empire comes together through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter, who is Juana, known as Juana the Crazy, and marries Philip the Handsome of the Habsburg Empire. Yeah, how would you like that? You know, she's Juana la Loca, the crazy, and then he's Philip the Handsome. So it's so horrible. In any case, when that union comes together, now the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Holland, become part of the Spanish Empire, the Habsburg Empire. This is where we're going to see lots of Spanish Jews moving into Holland because it's this kind of liminal zone. It's not Spain, and there's no Inquisition there in the 1490s. So that's where they're headed. And then what we can anticipate, and this is where you will see some of these depictions and silver plates and things like that of these famous, synagogues in Netherlands where they're using sand on the floor so that you can walk quietly in the synagogue, no one can hear anyone's in there. And this only then accelerates. They start to leave then by the 1600s. So this is directly in relationship to the Dutch East Indies like empire and that commercial group, as well as England's desire to colonize and move into the New World to basically fight off the Spanish. And the folks that are there to facilitate it are Sephardic Jews and their descendants who now say, we're more than happy to integrate these economic networks from Netherlands and England and move them into to the British Indies, into the Dutch Indies. So highly dynamic period from late 1300s to about 1600, and I think that's the space we're living in.
Thank you.
That's right. All right.
Thank you so much for this enlightening, wonderful, complex lecture. I would like to bring a question back to New Mexico and wonder if the story that you're telling through documentation of weddings and funerals and so forth is also found in folklore, in music. I've always had a curiosity about the songs of La Llorona, but I know there are just so many songs that are in the repertoire that make me wonder about the storytelling of the complexities of identity and the new La Raza that's being created, if you see that reflected in the music.
Wow, you're so spot on. This is what I love visiting with congregations like your own, because there's just a wealth of knowledge in the room. Yes, absolutely. I think all we have to think about is someone like Vanessa Paloma. Her parents live in Santa Fe. You might know Ron Duncan Hart or have heard his name. Uh, and Vanessa Paloma is Sephardic Jewish heritage and belief. And also, she practices the music of the medieval and early modern period. And there's clearly a connection to the music. There's all kinds of things that are embedded within it. It's a well-documented piece. And I think probably alongside of oral histories that we have, that is actually where we get the preservation of the Sephardic life, right? Because it can do double duty, right? It's just a song, right? It's just a song. It's nothing else. But we know it's more than a song. There's an internal private dialogue, a message for one community, and then there's a public dialogue that we're communicating to the other communities outside of ours. And in this way, maybe we can, in some ways, have it both ways. So I'm really glad you mentioned it, and I'm sure that Herschel might tag onto the idea maybe for next year's festival or something like that. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Roger Martinez-Davila. Thanks for kicking off this Festival Sefardí 2025. I think we're going to just ask for some help to get the chairs off to the sides. We want to get ready for our next show coming up with our youngsters Unbound. I saw them earlier rehearsing. And of course, thank you again.
Have a wonderful festival.
And come by anytime to your house. Your casa, tu casa espera aquí. So please get well.
Gracias, primos.
Adiós.